Thanks, Rowan. My name's Peter Ridland. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm talking today about IPM strategies for the serpentine leaf miner. First of all, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the history of this pest. The natives from South America, found in Peru, Argentina and Colombia, plus a few other places. But it's a classic secondary pest. Until the 1970s, it really wasn't an issue, but in Peru, they were spraying potato crops against the South American tomato pinworm, Tuta absoluta, which is ironically a pest that's spreading around the world by itself now. But anyway, that led to outbreaks of the leaf miner. Insecticide resistance increased, parasitoids were killed, and the Peruvian growers were onto a pesticide treadmill when basically they couldn't control their pest. Their potato crops were defoliating. The example of this is actually from South Africa, which is showing the level of damage you can get with a massive amount of leaf miner damage. The pest then spread substantially. It was first found in Europe in 1989 in glass houses. The growers there found they couldn't control it with the insecticides they'd been using to control, even with Liriomyza trifoli. Found in Africa the first time in 1990. But particularly in Kenya and South Africa, around the turn of the century, it became really important. In Kenya, it's a dominant leaf miner now. 95% of the Agromyzidae leaf miners in their vegetable crops are Ridland, and that's from lowlands right through to the highlands. There was spread from China and Southeast Asia in the mid-90s. Even in Canada, received it for the first time in 99. In their glass houses in Ontario, they believe it came from ornamentals that came from Costa Rica. It doesn't survive outside, but the general, every time you read about it, everybody blames infested ornamentals from the Netherlands. The Netherlands, of course, being the sort of the home of the ornamental global markets, but it's very difficult to prove really where they came from. But I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that the movement of ornamentals around the world has been instrumental in moving Liriomyza huidobrensis. And you'll hear the sound of a drum as I keep beating the drum that our previous speakers have said as well. But the universal theme with these pests are the destruction of their parasitoid wasps by excessive use of non-selective insecticides. Concurrent with that is the development of insecticide resistance within the fly populations. But the message is that effective management can be implemented. I was privileged to lead an ACR project in 2001 to 2004 in Indonesia, looking at Liriomyza huidobrensis. And I saw firsthand how stressful it was for farmers. They were spraying their potato crops 3 times a week and seemingly getting nowhere. I guess we're working with the scientists in Indonesia. We were able to demonstrate that it was possible to get away from that pesticide treadmill, look after parasitoids and use appropriate insecticides. In Southeast Asia and China, the populations of huidobrensis are settling down, but that's 25 years since they've had it, so it's not an instant success. In Australia, we're in year 0 and there's many unknowns. And I can't sit here and tell you all the answers because, of course, nobody knows them. The Australian horticultural landscape is varied. What will the seasonal abundance be? What will the phenology of the pest be? It'll vary from region to region. We need to know. We've only been going for 2 months, so we don't really know yet. Are the natural enemies responding? Fantastic news from Aaliyah even this morning that yes, they are, but in different places, in different crops, there'll be different natural enemies. But because we've got such a wide range of them already here, if we look after them, they will come. Anyway, yield losses on different crops, that will happen. There's different crops will be affected differently by leaf miners and also in different regions. We need to know what the important non-crop hosts are, which weeds will be helping to host the leaf miner in between crops, but also these non-crop hosts will be hosting parasitoids, which can act as reservoirs for growing properties. How do the leaf miners disperse, and the parasitoids, within the crop and also between properties? In terms of sampling and economic threshold, these have been done overseas, but we need to have Australian studies to work out how best to sample, what are the economic thresholds. That will vary if we're going from crop to crop, state to state. We've heard that there are a range of emergency use permits present already, but the immediate challenge for the next 2 or 3 years is to get those converted into insecticide registrations, because the emergency use permits have restrictions, and it is expected that industry, both chemical and horticultural industry, will move towards getting insecticides registered. We know overseas that organophosphates, synthetic pyrethroids, carbamates are all leaf miners resistant to all of them. But fortunately, New South Wales Department is already looking at the status of the populations in Australia. And more importantly, I'm sure they'll be looking at getting baseline data for the chemistries that we do want to use, so we can monitor for changes in susceptibility in time. But there are successful IPM approaches overseas. It's usually common sense. But the first one is you need to reduce the initial leaf miner pressure. You can't afford to have infested transplants. Simple thing. It's important to deep plough senescent crops so that the pupae are buried as deeply as possible. It makes it difficult for the flies to emerge. And overseas, it's been shown if you can actually spread the material before tillage, it will help a lot as well. If you can avoid planting new crops adjacent to old crops, that's useful. And also managing crop waste, the rejected produce and discarded leaves. If you have a heap of old mined leaves in a shed, near the shed nearby, that's going to be a reservoir for more flies to infest your crop. I'm a firm believer in understanding about these feeding punctures of the female Liriomyza. If you watch carefully on the top right-hand corner, you'll see a fly there going through her business. They basically puncture the leaves with their ovipositor, and they make a very small crater. At this time of the year, you'll see stippling on leaves, and it won't necessarily caused by leaf miners. Things like jacids will cause stippling on the epidermis, but when you look at it closely with a leaf on the leaf with a hand lens, you can see quite a difference, that the jacid just makes a very small stipple right on the top of the epidermis. The female leaf miners are actually making a small crater. And both males and females feed on the exuding sap, and it's actually quite an important part of their mating regime. Eggs are laid in about 10 to 15% of those punctures. So clearly the feeding punctures are much more prevalent than eggs. Excuse me. So it's important for conserving parasitoid wasps to actually monitor the pest activity. You need to know what's going on. So checking seedlings for feeding stipples and new mines is important. And also looking at some old leaves with a hand lens for live larvae. It's not much point in just counting numbers of mines on a leaf, because they may well be empty. They may contain dead larvae or parasitized larvae. So it's only actively feeding larvae that are really important. And by delaying sprays early in the crop, that actually allows the parasitoid populations to increase. And you must remember that host feeding by parasitoids will kill many leaf mining larvae. In fact, they may kill more leaf miner larvae by host feeding than they will actually cause by laying an egg. So they have to most of them have to feed on a larvae to help them develop their own eggs. So that's a key thing to remember. Maddie mentioned to start with about the development time of the leaf miners. I've just done a quick summary there. 50% of the time, the leaf miner's in the pupal stage, and 15% of the time it's in the egg stage. And these are stages that aren't accessible to insecticides. They aren't accessible to our parasitoids either, because the pupae are in the soil, eggs are too small. So it's really only a third of the time when we have actually larvae in the leaf. And that's when the parasitoids will act, and that's when the translaminar insecticides and the systemic insecticides will work. So it's a very small window. So that's always important to remember, that the larvae feeding, most of the damage is caused by the third instar larva, and that's a very small time of the whole life cycle of the leaf miner. Avoiding post-broad-spectrum insecticides is super important. Rowan's gone through it. Systemic and translaminar. Make sure you have the right adjuvants. Rotating chemical groups is important, and you really have to consider the effect of other insecticides that target other pests. I'm there smiling at the back of a farmer field school in Indonesia. I put that slide in mainly because one enterprising chemical company has hats for the growers, but advertising Trigard and Agromyzidae. So it's seromazine and abamectin, two very important chemical groups for rotation. So that was one good way of getting the message across to the growers in Indonesia. Give them a free hat. So just recapping, the presence of leaf mines does not mean you need to intervene immediately. Counting active mines with a hand lens is important. You can use your torch from your mobile phone to help to give a backlight, and that can help to see these actively feeding larvae that we saw on a video before. Yellow sticky traps do trap a lot of flies, and they're probably their main virtue is when you've got a new crop in, you can quickly detect whether you're getting invasion from nearby crops. It's pretty hard to get population dynamics from a yellow sticky trap, but they do detect invasion. Potentially you can use pupil traps to monitor the number of pupae coming out of the leaf, and that's certainly in other countries, that's proved a very good way in some crops of monitoring adults. And certainly parasitism up to 50% or over 50% will definitely keep the leaf miners under the spray thresholds. But we're talking there about overseas work. So again, sampling strategies, economic thresholds, and the effect of parasitism will need to be crop specific, and they must be tailored to Australian cropping situations. Thank you.